The late afternoon sun, the color of warm honey, poured through the bay windows of our living room. It was a benevolent, celebratory light, the kind that seemed to conspire with the occasion. It caught the cut crystal vase on the mantelpiece, refracting into 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced on the opposite wall. It illuminated the dust motes suspended in the air, turning them into a lazy, glittering galaxy. And it cast a halo around the black velvet square of Clara's graduation cap, which sat in a place of honor on the mahogany coffee table, its golden tassel resting on a stack of art history books. The air itself felt thick and sweet, heavy with the cloying perfume of the stargazer lilies Richard had insisted upon, their scent mingling with the faint, pleasant aroma of old books and lemon oil polish. It was a scene of domestic triumph, meticulously curated and flawlessly executed. A perfect picture of a perfect family on a perfect day. From my position in the wingback chair, I watched my husband, Richard, play the role he had been born to inhabit, the magnanimous patriarch. He moved with an unhurried grace, his tall frame cutting an elegant figure against the backdrop of our book-lined walls. He was pouring champagne, a bottle of Veuve Clicquot he'd been saving. He held the bottle with a practiced ease, his thumb nestled in the punt, the golden liquid cascading into the flutes without a single wasted drop. Everything about him was a performance of effortless success. The crisp white shirt, the bespoke trousers, the faint, confident smile playing on his lips. He was a man entirely comfortable in his own skin, convinced of his place at the center of the universe. I used to find that confidence magnetic. Now, I saw it for the glittering, hollow shell it was. Clara, my daughter, my brilliant, beautiful Clara, sat on the edge of the sofa, her face flushed with a mixture of pride and relief. Her degree, summa cum laude, was framed and waiting in the study. She was luminous, vibrating with the untapped energy of a future just beginning to unfold. She watched her father with the uncomplicated adoration she had always reserved for him, the adoration he had so carefully cultivated. He was her hero, the man who could solve any problem, charm any skeptic, and who always had a plan. My heart ached with a fierce, protective love for her, a sharp pang of guilt for the curated reality that was about to be irrevocably shattered. I had shielded her for months, building a firewall around her final semester, wanting nothing to tarnish this achievement. But the storm had followed us home. Richard finished pouring and handed a glass to Clara, his smile widening as he met her eyes. "For you, sweetheart. All that hard work paid off. We knew it would." He then turned to me, his eyes holding mine for a fraction of a second too long. There was something in his gaze I had been studying for months, a cool, calculating distance that masqueraded as affection. It was the look of a man who had already left the room, who was merely waiting for the opportune moment to close the door behind him. He held my flute out to me, and as my fingers brushed his, I felt no warmth, only the faint, cold rigidity of his skin. He raised his own glass, the crystal catching the light. The room fell into a reverent silence, the kind that precedes a toast. I could feel the weight of the moment, the culmination of 25 years of shared history, of family dinners and school plays, of whispered secrets and feigned forgiveness. All of it was compressed into this single, sun-drenched tableau. "To Clara," he began, his voice a rich baritone that resonated with practiced sincerity. He turned his gaze to her, and she beamed, raising her glass in response. "To a future as bright and brilliant as you are. Your mother and I could not be prouder." He paused, letting the sentiment settle in the air. This was the script. This was the expected, heartwarming beat. But then he took a small breath, a subtle shift in his posture, the almost imperceptible movement of a predator repositioning itself for the kill. His eyes left Clara and found mine again. The amiable mask dropped, replaced by a glint I recognized with a sickening lurch. It was the look of triumph, the cold, polished satisfaction of a checkmate delivered. "And," he continued, his voice taking on a new, almost theatrical gravity, "to new beginnings." He let the phrase hang in the air, a baited hook. Clara's expression shifted from beaming pride to mild confusion. I remained perfectly still, my champagne flute held steady in my hand, my expression a carefully constructed mask of serene attentiveness. I had been rehearsing this moment in my mind for 112 days. In fact, he said, his focus now entirely on me, his voice dropping slightly, as if sharing an intimate confidence, though its cruelty was designed for public consumption. I've decided it's time I start my own. The silence that followed was no longer reverent. It was a vacuum, sucking the warmth and air from the room. The lilies suddenly smelled funereal. The sunbeam hitting the floor seemed harsh and interrogating. Clara's hand, holding her champagne flute, froze halfway to her lips. Richard delivered the final lines with a surgeon's precision. I'll be moving out tomorrow, Eleanor. Isabella and I have found a place on the coast. Isabella. He said her name as if it were an accomplishment, a prize he had won. Isabella, his protégée at the architectural firm, a woman with sharp ambition and a haircut that cost more than our monthly grocery bill. A woman I had hosted in this very living room for Christmas, listening to her praise my pot roast while she was sleeping with my husband. The name didn't detonate like a bomb. It seeped into the room like a colorless, odorless gas, poisoning everything it touched. I watched Clara. I saw the precise moment the words registered, the physical manifestation of heartbreak. The light in her eyes didn't just dim, it was extinguished. Her face, so full of joy moments before, crumpled into a mask of disbelief and horror. A small, choked sound escaped her lips, and the champagne flute slipped from her grasp, shattering on the hardwood floor. The sound was obscenely loud in the suffocating silence, the glittering spray of glass and golden liquid of violent, chaotic stain on the carefully polished wood. Richard flinched at the sound, his perfect moment momentarily spoiled by such a messy display of emotion. He looked at Clara, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features before being replaced by a look of practiced, paternal concern. Clara, sweetheart, I know this is a shock. But his attention was drawn back to me. He was waiting for my reaction. I knew what he expected, what he craved. The tears, the accusations, a hysterical outburst that would validate his narrative of me as an unstable, emotional woman from whom he was justified in escaping. He wanted a scene, one that would cast him as the calm, rational man forced to make a difficult but necessary choice. He wanted to be the hero of this tragedy. I would not give it to him. Instead of the tears he anticipated, I offered him a slow, serene smile. It did not reach my eyes. My eyes, I knew, were as cold and still as a frozen lake. I raised my glass, the one I had not dropped, in a mock toast. A new beginning. I repeated, my voice a soft, chilling whisper that cut through the tension more effectively than a shout ever could. How fitting. I took a delicate sip of my champagne, the bubbles fizzing on my tongue, and then I placed the flute down on the end table with a quiet, definitive click. I ignored the shattered glass on the floor. I ignored Clara's ragged, suppressed sobs. My entire focus was on Richard, on the dawning confusion that was beginning to cloud his triumphant expression. He had expected a tempest. I had given him ice. With a slowness that felt both deliberate and predatory, I rose from my chair. The fabric of my silk dress rustled softly. I walked not towards him, not towards my heartbroken daughter, but towards the antique secretary desk that stood in the corner of the room. The desk had belonged to my grandmother, a formidable woman who had navigated the Great Depression by her wits and buried 2 husbands. It was made of dark, unyielding cherry wood, its surface scarred with the history of 100 difficult decisions and flawlessly executed plans. It was my inheritance, a symbol of a strength Richard had always mistaken for fragility. My hand did not tremble as I unlocked the top drawer with a small brass key I wore on a chain around my neck. Inside, nestled amongst stationery and old fountain pens, was another key. It was small and ornate, made of solid silver, cool and heavy in my palm. It felt like a weapon. I closed the drawer, turned, and walked back to the center of the room, stopping before the coffee table, a small island of civilization in a sea of emotional wreckage. Richard watched my every move, his head tilted, a deep frown line forming between his brows. He was no longer the confident narrator of this scene. He had lost the script. I bent down and placed the silver key on the polished surface of the table, next to Clara's graduation cap. It landed not with a clatter, but with a quiet, solid thud. The sound was final. It was the sound of a lock turning, of a door closing forever. Richard stared at the key as if it were a scorpion. "What's this?" he asked, his voice losing its confident baritone. taking on a higher, uncertain pitch. The drive to the bank was, for Richard, a victory lap conducted in the hushed, leather-scented confines of his Mercedes S-Class. The car was a recent acquisition, a sleek beast of obsidian black and chrome that hummed with a quiet power he felt mirrored his own. Beside him, Isabella was a portrait of composed beauty, her blonde hair catching the morning light, her sunglasses hiding whatever flicker of doubt might have resided in her eyes. Richard felt no doubt. He felt a profound, intoxicating sense of liberation, the kind a man feels when he has successfully shed a burdensome past for a gleaming, custom-designed future. He was the architect of his own destiny, and tomorrow, construction would begin. He glanced at Isabella, admiring the clean, sharp line of her jaw. She represented the future, ambitious, uncluttered by sentiment, a partner who understood that life was a project to be managed, not an emotional bog to be waded through. He contrasted her with Eleanor, whose very presence had begun to feel like a weight, the silent accumulation of shared disappointments, the unspoken expectation of fidelity, the comfortable but stifling predictability of it all. Leaving her was not an act of cruelty, he rationalized, but an act of self-preservation, an act of becoming. "I still don't understand why we're doing this," Isabella said, her voice a low murmur that he found endlessly appealing. It lacked the weary familiarity of Eleanor's tone, the subtle undertones of shared history and unspoken obligations. Isabella's voice was a clean slate, a safe deposit box. "It feels so theatrical, a little desperate." Richard chuckled, a rich, confident sound that filled the car. "Darling, that's Eleanor to a T, predictably theatrical. She's always believed in grand gestures, in the symbolic power of sentiment. She thinks a box of old memories, of faded photographs from our wedding and dried-out corsages from some university dance, will somehow guilt me, pull me back from the brink. It's pathetic, really, but it's a necessary final step. A closing of the books." He reached over and squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing a confident circle on her skin. "Consider it the final, quaint ritual of a life I'm leaving behind. For us." He was already narrating the story for Isabella, for himself. He was the vital, forward-looking visionary, and Eleanor was the anchor, the keeper of a dusty museum of a marriage he had long since outgrown. The small, silver key Eleanor had given him felt insignificant in his pocket, a relic from a bygone era. He pictured its contents with a kind of benevolent condescension. Letters he'd written her from business trips in his younger, more naive years, a lock of Clara's baby hair tied with a blue ribbon, perhaps the deed to a cemetery plot she'd morbidly purchased years ago. He imagined himself looking through the contents with a kind of detached pity, a sigh for the woman who could only look backward. Then he would close the lid and walk away forever, magnanimously leaving her to her ghosts while he stepped into the sun. Isabella was silent for a moment, her manicured nails tapping a restless rhythm on her designer handbag. She turned her head to look out the window at the passing blur of downtown's financial district. "And you're absolutely sure about the finances? Everything is in place for the Sausalito condo?" "Absolutely," he said, a touch of irritation creeping into his voice. He had already explained this. The private account, which he'd been carefully, brilliantly seeding for the better part of 2 years, was more than sufficient for the down payment and initial renovations. Eleanor, for all her meticulousness with household budgets and grocery lists, had been blissfully, almost willfully, ignorant of their larger investment portfolio. She trusted him implicitly with the big picture. That was her great weakness, he mused. Her trust. He saw it not as a gift he had squandered, but as a strategic vulnerability he had expertly exploited. "She has no idea," he added, reassuring both Isabella and himself. "She thinks we're still putting extra into our retirement fund. She thinks we're a team." The corner of his mouth twitched into a smirk. The bank was a monument to the very power Richard saw reflected in himself. A neoclassical fortress of granite and marble, its polished brass doors opened into a lobby so vast and quiet it felt more like a cathedral than a place of commerce. The ceiling soared 3 stories high, adorned with gilded frescoes. The hushed reverence, the scent of old money and floor wax, the cool, still air, it all affirmed his sense of belonging. This was his world. He approached the private client desk, Isabella a step behind him, her heels clicking a sharp counterpoint to the lobby's muffled quiet. "Richard Sterling," he announced to the young woman behind the expansive mahogany desk. "I have an appointment to access safe deposit box 714. He was expecting to be handled by a junior associate, one of the eager young men who always seemed so impressed by him. Instead, a senior manager emerged from a frosted glass office. Mr. Abernathy was a man who seemed to be composed entirely of gray suit, gray hair, a face the color of weathered stone. He offered a thin, professional smile that did not reach his eyes. There was a disconcerting stillness about him. "Mr. Sterling, of course. We were expecting you. This way, please." Abernathy led them not to the gleaming, modern vault on the ground floor, but towards a private, wood-paneled elevator tucked away in a quiet alcove. "Box 714 is in the old trust vault," he explained, his voice as dry as old paper. "It's one of the original family boxes from the bank's founding." Richard felt a flicker of annoyance, a familiar irritation. An old family box. Eleanor's family, of course. The Caldwells had been founding members of the city's society, a fact Eleanor rarely mentioned but which clung to her like the scent of lavender and old money. Richard had always felt a private resentment toward that lineage, the unearned privilege of it, even as he had used her family's initial investment, a gift, they'd called it, to launch his first, fumbling business attempts. He had long since surpassed them, he told himself. He had turned their quaint seed money into a veritable forest. This trip to the old trust vault felt like one last, posthumous power play from her ancestors. The elevator descended with a soft, hydraulic hum, opening into a colder, quieter corridor. The air here was different, still and heavy, smelling faintly of metal and concrete. The final gate to the vault was a formidable latticework of polished steel, thick as a man's wrist. Abernathy produced his own key, then gestured for Richard to do the same with the bank's guard key, which the manager held. The mechanics were intricate, requiring a synchronized turn. The gate swung open with a well-oiled, nearly silent sigh, revealing rows upon rows of deposit boxes, their brass and steel faces gleaming under the stark, utilitarian light. Abernathy led them to a far wall, where a set of larger, more ornate boxes stood apart from the others, like tombs in a private mausoleum. He stopped at 714. It was larger than the standard boxes, its door made of dark, burnished bronze, with the Caldwell family crest, a stylized heron, poised and patient, faintly engraved in the center. "Here you are, Mr. Sterling," Abernathy said. He used a key to unlock one of the two locks, his movements precise and economical. He then stepped back, his expression unreadable. "The viewing rooms are just through that door to the left. Please let the attendant know when you are finished." He gave a slight, formal bow and retreated, his footsteps echoing in the silence until the steel gate clicked shut, leaving Richard and Isabella alone in the heart of the vault. The silence that descended was absolute. A sense of theatricality settled over Richard again, chasing away the brief chill. He turned to Isabella with a wry smile. "The family crypt. A bit much, don't you think? Ready for a trip down memory lane?" He inserted the small silver key Eleanor had given him. It felt ancient in his hand. The lock turned with a satisfying, mechanical clunk that seemed to echo in the profound stillness. He pulled the handle, and the heavy bronze door swung open. Inside was a long, dark metal box, surprisingly plain compared to the door. It was heavy as he slid it out, the weight of it unexpected. He carried it to the nearest private viewing room, a small, featureless cubicle with a gray table and two unforgivingly upright chairs. The room was sterile, soundproof, and claustrophobic. He placed the box on the table between them. The lid was unadorned. For a fleeting moment, the same strange premonition pricked at him, a sense of deep unease. The setting was too cold, too clinical for the sentimental journey he had anticipated. He shook it off. This was Eleanor's last, desperate gambit. He was humoring her. He lifted the lid. The contents were nestled on a bed of stark, black velvet. There were no letters. No faded photographs of their wedding day. No trinkets. No lock of baby hair. His heart gave a hard, sudden thud against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was not a plea. This was an indictment. The first thing his eyes landed on was a stack of photographs, about 20 of them, printed on high-gloss, professional-grade paper. The top one was a shot of him. They emerged from the cool, tomb-like stillness of the bank into the harsh, indifferent glare of the midday sun. The sudden warmth felt like a physical blow. Richard blinked, his eyes struggling to adjust. The bustling city street, which moments before had represented the vibrant theater of his success, now seemed chaotic and hostile. The cheerful cacophony of traffic, conversations, and distant sirens grated on his raw nerves. The box in his hands was no longer just heavy. It felt radioactive, a lead-lined container holding the toxic decay of his life. His knuckles were white where he gripped the handle. Isabella walked beside him, but the space between them had become a chasm. She had not spoken a word during the silent elevator ride up from the vault, nor during the long walk across the marble lobby, a walk that felt like a public shaming. He had felt the eyes of every teller, every customer, and most of all, the placid, all-knowing gaze of Mr. Abernathy on his back. He had entered the bank a king inspecting his domain. He left like a convicted man being led from the courthouse. They stopped on the crowded sidewalk, an island of frozen tension amidst the flowing river of pedestrians. Richard finally found his voice, a ragged, desperate sound that was alien to his own ears. "It's a bluff," he hissed, the words a frantic prayer. He turned to Isabella, searching her face for an ally, for a reflection of his own desperate need to believe this was all some elaborate, vindictive fantasy. "It has to be. That prenup, it's ancient. It's a scare tactic. No court would uphold it after 25 years. It's ludicrous." Isabella did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the middle distance, her jaw tight. She slowly removed her sunglasses, and her eyes, when they finally met his, were not filled with fear or sympathy. They were as cold and clear as glass, and in their depths, he saw the chilling glint of a rapid, brutal calculation. "The prenup is only part of the problem, Richard," she said, her voice stripped of all its former warmth. It was flat, clinical, the voice of an auditor reviewing a catastrophic balance sheet. "The ledger is the problem. The photographs are the problem. She has proof, not just of the affair, but of premeditated financial deception. Intent. That's what a judge will see. She can't prove," he started, but his own words died in his throat. The ledger, in Eleanor's meticulous hand, was irrefutable. Isabella's lip curled in a faint, contemptuous sneer. "And the money," she continued, her voice dropping to a low, furious pitch. "Let's talk about the money, shall we? You told me the side account was your war chest. You told me it had nearly 7 figures. You said that was the foundation for our new life. Those documents," she gestured vaguely towards the box in his hands, "show barely a quarter of that. Where's the rest of it, Richard?" "I was building it up," he snapped, his composure finally cracking, his voice rising in panic. "It was a process. I had to be careful. For us." He was pleading now, and he hated the pathetic, whining tone of his own voice. He was Richard Sterling. He did not plead. "For you," she corrected him, her voice like a shard of ice. "You were building an escape hatch for yourself. You were planning to buy a multi-million-dollar condo that I couldn't possibly co-sign on, while leaving your wife with what you thought was a fraction of your shared wealth. What in God's name makes you think you wouldn't eventually do the exact same thing to me?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable because they both knew the answer. He saw himself through her eyes then, not as a powerful partner, but as a liability. A man with a proven history of betrayal, whose assets were a fraction of what he had claimed, and who was now facing a legal battle that would likely strip him of even that. Just then, as he was scrambling for a response, for a lie convincing enough to patch the gaping hole in his credibility, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The vibration felt jarring, violent. He ignored it, his focus entirely on Isabella, on trying to salvage the wreckage of their future. "Isabella, listen to me," he said, reaching for her arm. "This is a setback. It's an ambush, but it's manageable. I have the best lawyers. We can fight this. We can argue duress on the prenup. We can." She pulled her arm away as if his touch were repellent. "Don't," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you have a strategy. You were caught, Richard. Completely and utterly." The phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. A persistent, nagging vibration. With a curse, Richard fumbled in his pocket and pulled it out. The screen was lit up with an email notification. The sender was an address he didn't recognize, but the subject line made the blood drain from his face and pool in his feet. Urgent. Notice of judicial asset freeze. Sterling versus Sterling. Case #74. C. 2023. His thumb trembled as he tapped the screen. The email was from his primary bank's legal compliance department. It was dense with legal jargon that swam before his eyes, but the key phrases leapt out at him like flames. Pursuant to an ex parte petition granted this morning by Judge Marianne Jennings. Compelling evidence of significant financial dissipation. All marital assets, including but not limited to checking account #, savings account #, and the investment portfolio held at Sterling and Finch account #, are hereby frozen pending a preliminary hearing. Access is restricted until further notice, pending full financial discovery. Frozen. The word echoed in the cavernous, empty space that had just opened up inside his chest. Not just the joint accounts Eleanor managed. Everything. The vast investment portfolio that was the engine of his wealth. The accounts from which he drew his salary, paid his expenses, and funded his entire existence. All of it, seized by a single, invisible judicial order. Eleanor hadn't just prepared a case. She had launched a preemptive strike. She had cut off his supply lines before the battle had even begun. He swayed slightly on his feet, the bustling sidewalk tilting at a nauseating angle. All he had left was this secret account, the one he had so proudly built, the one that now felt like a pittance, a child's allowance. And even that, he realized with a fresh wave of horror, was likely already being targeted for discovery. He must have made a sound, a strangled gasp, because Isabella's sharp gaze snapped from his face to the phone in his hand. She leaned in, read the first few lines of the email over his shoulder, and then took a half-step back. Her expression shifted one final, terrifying time. The anger and contempt were gone, replaced by a look of utter, dispassionate finality. It was the look a CEO gives before announcing a department is being eliminated. She looked him up and down, from his expensive shoes to his suddenly sweat-sheened forehead. Her assessment was swift, silent, and brutal. He felt like he was being liquidated. "I'm a businesswoman, Richard," she said, her voice calm and steady, the most devastating sound he had ever heard. "I build things. I invest in growth, in strength, in assets with a future. I do not," she paused, letting the words land with precision, "invest in failing enterprises." Without another word, she turned away from him, her back straight, her posture radiating a formidable, unshakable resolve. She raised a hand, and a yellow taxi, as if summoned by her sheer force of will, immediately detached itself from the flow of traffic and pulled up to the curb. She opened the back door, slid inside without a backward glance, and was gone, absorbed back into the city's relentless, forward motion. She had excised him from her life with the clean, swift cut of a surgeon removing a tumor. Richard stood alone on the sidewalk, the heavy box clutched in his hand, the damning email glowing on his phone screen. The city roared around him, but he was in a pocket of absolute silence. People jostled past him, a river of purpose and destination, while he was suddenly anchorless, adrift. He was no longer Richard Sterling, titan of industry, master of his universe. He was just a man on a sidewalk, holding a box of his own ruin. Panic, cold and sharp, finally broke through the shock. He needed his lawyer. He needed Alan, the pit bull who had handled his firm's contracts for years. He fumbled with his phone, his fingers slick with sweat, and speed-dialed Alan's number. It went straight to voicemail. "Alan, it's Richard. Richard Sterling," he said into the phone, his voice sounding thin and reedy. "It's an emergency. A complete goddamn emergency. Eleanor, she's ambushed me. There's a prenup, financials, she's frozen everything. Call me back. Call me back now." He hung up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, cars and people a meaningless blur. The sun beat down on his head. The weight of the box seemed to be pulling him down into the pavement. He felt a desperate, primal urge to simply drop it, to let it spill its contents into the gutter and just walk away. But he couldn't. It was his only evidence of the scale of the catastrophe. He started walking, with no destination in mind. His confident stride was gone, replaced by a shambling, uncertain gait. He walked past storefronts displaying luxuries he had always taken for granted, Swiss watches, Italian suits, minimalist furniture, and they seemed to mock him. The garden was my mother's sanctuary. It was the one place where the carefully curated perfection of the house gave way to a more organic, untamable kind of beauty. It was a riot of color and scent, of stubborn life that clung to the earth. I found her there, kneeling on a foam pad, her back to the house. She was pruning the roses, the deep crimson Mr. Lincolns that were my father's supposed favorites, though he never once touched them himself. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and focused, each snip of the shears a small, decisive act. She was not crying. She was not raging. She was simply tending her garden, as if the world had not just tilted on its axis. I stood on the stone patio for a long moment, watching her. The shattered champagne flute had been swept up, the spilled liquid mopped from the floor, but the ghost of the afternoon's violence lingered in the air. After my father had stormed out, confused, angry, clutching that strange silver key, I had remained frozen on the sofa, adrift in a sea of bewilderment. My mother had paused at the doorway, looked back at me, and said only 2 words, "Give me an hour." Then she was gone. I had spent that hour in a state of suspended shock. My mind kept replaying the scene, a grotesque, looping film. My father's confident smile curdling into confusion. My mother's chilling calm, her serene delivery of a line that had detonated our lives. "Your new beginning, Richard." It didn't make sense. My parents' marriage, from my perspective, was a stable, if quiet, institution. It was the bedrock on which my own life had been built. There were no shouting matches, no slammed doors, no obvious signs of discord. There was only a comfortable, predictable rhythm. I had mistaken the absence of passion for the presence of peace. My father had called my cell phone 3 times. I let each call go to voicemail. I couldn't speak to him. I couldn't reconcile the man who had held me that morning, his voice thick with pride as he told me I was his greatest achievement, with the cruel stranger who had publicly discarded my mother on the proudest day of my life. And Isabella. The name was a wound. A woman I knew, a woman who had complimented my thesis work at a Christmas party, her professional praise now feeling like a vile, calculated deception. Finally, unable to bear the suffocating silence of the house, I came out here. I needed to see my mother, to find an anchor in the storm. Her calmness was the most terrifying part of it all. It was unnatural. "Mom," I said, my voice hoarse. It sounded small in the open air. She finished one last, precise snip, severing a withered bloom from its stem, before she turned her head to look at me. Her face was placid, her eyes clear. There were no tear tracks on her cheeks, only a smudge of dirt. She looked centered. It was this unnerving composure that finally broke me. The tears I had been holding back began to fall, hot and silent. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, the words thick with a hurt that was both for her and for myself. Hurt that she had endured this alone. Hurt that I had been so blind. "How could you stand there like that? Why didn't you scream at him?" She set her shears down carefully on the grass beside her and rose to her feet, brushing the dirt from her knees. She came towards me and wrapped her arms around me, her embrace firm and steady. She smelled of roses and earth. "Screaming would have been a performance for his benefit, Clara," she said softly, her voice close to my ear. "It's what he wanted. It would have validated his decision, painted him as the victim of an unstable woman. I refused to give him that satisfaction. Some battles aren't won with noise." She led me to the stone bench under the old oak tree, a place where she had read to me as a child. We sat, and for a long moment, we just listened to the sounds of the garden, the buzz of a bee, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. "I didn't tell you," she began, her gaze fixed on the rose bushes, "because your only job for the past 4 years, and especially this last semester, was to succeed. Your only job was to focus on your future. My job," her voice hardened almost imperceptibly, "was to make sure you could do that without this chaos derailing you. I have been building a firewall around you for months, sweetheart. I wasn't going to let his mess become your burden." The word months hung in the air. "Months?" I echoed, incredulous. "You've known for months?" She turned to look at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I had never seen before. Not the gentle, maternal warmth I was used to, but a flicker of something harder, sharper. It was the look of a strategist, a survivor. "I've suspected for over a year," she said, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. The late nights at the office that didn't appear on the shared calendar. The hushed phone calls he'd take on the patio. The credit card bill I accidentally opened and saw a charge for a hotel in Napa. A business trip I was never told about. Little things. Little tears in the fabric of the life we had woven. At first, I ignored them. I told myself I was being paranoid. It's what women in my position are conditioned to do. We are taught to value stability above all else, to smooth over the cracks rather than investigate their source. She took a deep breath. But the real proof came 8 months ago. I was reconciling our accounts, as I always do. Your father has always been dismissive of what he calls my household bookkeeping, but it has given me a very clear picture of our financial landscape for 25 years. I noticed a discrepancy. A large transfer from our main investment portfolio, a portfolio he manages, that didn't have a corresponding deposit in any of our other accounts. When I asked him about it, he was slick. He spun some story about a short-term, high-yield bond that had to be purchased through a different holding company. It sounded plausible. He's always been plausible. But you didn't believe him, I stated, understanding dawning. A thin, mirthless smile touched her lips. I wanted to. It would have been easier. But my father, your grandfather, was a banker. He taught me one thing above all else. Money leaves a trail. Always. So, I started my own investigation. Quietly. I didn't want to be the hysterical wife, so I became a forensic accountant in my own home. I created a separate spreadsheet. I tracked everything. And the more I looked, the more I found. A systematic siphoning of funds. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. All moved into an account I couldn't see. A secret financial life he was building parallel to ours. I stared at her, stunned into silence. This was my mother, the woman who organized book club meetings and volunteered at the library, running a covert financial investigation against her own husband. The money was one thing, she continued, her voice losing its clinical edge and taking on a note of deep, resonant pain. It was a betrayal, yes, but of a kind I could almost understand. Your father has always been greedy for more, but I had to know where the money was going. I had to know the why. So I did something I never thought I would do. I hired a private investigator. She said the words so calmly, as if she were talking about hiring a gardener. He was discreet. An ex-cop your grandfather had used for due diligence checks years ago. I paid him from a small trust my grandmother left me, a fund your father never knew existed. Within a week, I had my answer. Her name was Isabella, and the investigator's report was comprehensive. She paused, her gaze turning inward, and for the first time, I saw the true depth of the wound, the raw agony she had been concealing beneath her composure. He gave me a file, Clara, a file filled with photographs. Your father and her, dining in expensive restaurants he told me we couldn't afford, leaving hotels, looking at property listings on the coast, laughing. They looked happy, in a way he hadn't looked with me in years. Her voice broke, just for a second, a single, fragile crack in the dam. She cleared her throat and continued. The investigator also gave me transcripts of conversations. He had a contact at a data recovery firm. Your father had been careless with his cloud backups. I read their text messages, their plans. They called me the warden. They talked about his liberation day. He promised her he would leave me the day after your graduation, so as not to spoil your big moment. The magnanimity of it was breathtaking. I felt sick. The image of them laughing, calling my mother the warden while I was stressing over my final exams, while my mother was planning my graduation party, was a profound, nauseating betrayal. So the key, I whispered, my mind finally connecting the pieces. The divorce papers he found? That was all part of it. She nodded. Once I had the proof, the emotional part of me died. It was a strange, cold grief. But the practical part of me, the part your grandfather nurtured, took over. I couldn't be a victim, Clara. I had to have a strategy. I met with a lawyer, one of the best matrimonial attorneys in the state. We went over everything. The finances, the affair, the deception. And then we went over the prenuptial agreement. The prenup? I said, my voice filled with disbelief. Dad always told me he signed that to protect you. He said he was a young, ambitious guy with nothing, and he wanted to make sure that if he failed, you and your family's money were safe. A dry, bitter laugh escaped my mother's lips. It was a sound I had never heard from her before. Oh, that was the story he told, wasn't it? The noble, self-effacing narrative he constructed. He was a master of narrative. The truth, Clara, is that I insisted on it. My father insisted on it. My father saw your father for exactly what he was. The 10 days between the uncorking in my living room and the preliminary settlement meeting were a blur of logistics and a masterclass in emotional compartmentalization. While Richard was, I imagined, scrambling through the 5 stages of grief and financial panic, I was executing the plan I had spent the better part of a year refining. My home, once a shared space, transformed into a command center. The dining room table, where we had hosted countless dinner parties, was now covered not with linen and silver, but with legal documents, financial statements, and color-coded binders. My lawyer, a sharp, empathetic woman named Catherine Vance, became a more frequent visitor than any friend had been in years. Clara was my shadow, my quiet, steadfast support. The initial shock had given way to a steely resolve that mirrored my own. She fielded the endless, probing calls from our so-called friends and family, her voice a perfect blend of polite dismissal and unwavering loyalty. "Mom's handling it," she would say, her tone leaving no room for argument. "We'd appreciate some privacy right now." She made coffee. She organized files. She sat with me late into the night, not always talking, but simply being present, a silent partner in the dismantling of our old life and the construction of a new one. Richard, meanwhile, was imploding. The asset freeze had been a catastrophic blow. I knew from Catherine's updates that he had been forced to retain a second-tier law firm. His usual high-powered corporate attorneys at Sterling and Finch had politely but firmly declined to represent him in a domestic matter, especially one where his personal finances, so deeply entwined with the firm's, were under such scrutiny. His new lawyer, a man named Garrett, was known for his aggressive, blustering style, a tactic that Catherine assured me would be utterly ineffective against the mountain of evidence we possessed. Richard had tried to reach me directly, of course. His initial voicemails were a storm of blustering rage and disbelief. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Eleanor? This is insane. You'll destroy us both." Then came the threats of legal retribution, vague promises of countersuits, and accusations of malicious intent. When those were met with silence, his tone shifted to one of wounded pleading. "Eleanor, please, 25 years, don't throw it all away over a mistake. We can talk about this. Just us. No lawyers." He still didn't understand. He thought this was a negotiation, a dramatic marital spat. He hadn't yet grasped that this was a foreclosure. He had defaulted on the terms of our life together, and I was simply collecting on the debt. The day of the settlement meeting arrived, gray and drizzling, the sky the color of wet cement. It felt appropriate. Catherine and I arrived at her firm's offices 20 minutes early. The conference room was a pristine, sterile space on the 34th floor, with a panoramic view of the city skyline shrouded in mist. The long, polished mahogany table felt like a dueling ground. I chose the seat facing the door, my back to the window. I wanted to see his face when he walked in. I wanted to watch him realize that the power dynamic of our entire relationship had been permanently inverted. Catherine spread our documents neatly in front of me. A copy of the prenup, the damning ledger, a summary of Richard's secret account activity, and the court order for the asset freeze. It was a formidable arsenal. "Remember, Eleanor," Catherine said, her voice calm and steadying. "We are not here to negotiate. We are here to present the terms. He has no leverage. The evidence is irrefutable. His only rational move is to surrender." Richard arrived precisely on time, accompanied by his lawyer, Garrett. The moment he walked through the door, I could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere. He had always been a man who expanded to fill any space he entered, his confidence a palpable force. Today, he seemed diminished, shrunken. His expensive suit hung on him slightly, as if he'd lost weight. His face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under his eyes that his residual tan couldn't hide. He looked older, not by 10 days, but by 10 years. His lawyer, Garrett, was the opposite. He was a bull of a man, with a florid face and an overly firm handshake, radiating an aggressive, artificial bonhomie. He was all bluster, a stark contrast to Catherine's quiet, lethal competence. Richard's eyes found mine across the table. I saw a flicker of the old arrogance, a last gasp of defiance, quickly extinguished by a wave of weary desperation. He looked away first. It was a small victory, but a significant one. We took our seats. The air was thick with unspoken hostility. Garrett started, his voice booming in the quiet room. All right, Catherine, let's cut to the chase. This whole production is absurd. My client is prepared to be reasonable, generous even, in a standard 50-50 dissolution. But this ambush, this asset freeze, it's malicious, it's punitive, and frankly, it won't hold up in court. A 25-year-old prenup? It's a historical document, not a legal one. Catherine didn't flinch. She let the bluster hang in the air for a moment before responding, her voice cool and precise. Garrett, you know as well as I do that under state law, the duration of a prenuptial agreement is determined by its own text. And if you'll direct your attention to Section 18 of the document in front of you, she slid a copy across the table. You'll see it explicitly states its terms remain in effect for the full duration of the marriage and any subsequent legal proceedings. There is no expiration clause. Your argument is without merit. Garrett grunted, flipping through the pages with more force than necessary. Richard stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language. And as for the asset freeze, Catherine continued, her tone sharpening slightly, it wasn't granted on the basis of the prenup alone. It was granted on the basis of this. She slid a copy of the ledger across the table. A meticulously documented 18-month history of systematic financial dissipation. Over $250,000 funneled from marital assets into a secret, private account. That's not just grounds for an asset freeze, Garrett. That's textbook financial fraud. And we have the wire transfer records to prove it. Richard visibly flinched, his gaze fixed on his own lies, now chronicled in his wife's elegant script. Garrett's florid face seemed to lose some of its color. He had clearly been unprepared for the sheer volume and quality of our evidence. He had walked in expecting a skirmish and found himself facing a fortified army. He changed tactics, turning to me, his voice adopting a tone of condescending reason. Eleanor, Mrs. Sterling, surely you can see this is needlessly destructive. Think of your history. Think of your daughter. A protracted, ugly court battle will only hurt everyone. Richard is prepared to offer you the house, free and clear, and a very substantial alimony package. Let's be adults about this. It was time. I looked at Catherine, who gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I drew a breath and spoke for the first time, my voice emerging steadier and stronger than I had expected. Mr. Garrett, I said, my gaze fixed on my husband, there will be no court battle. There will be no negotiation over alimony. The terms are not up for discussion. They are dictated by this document. I tapped my finger on the cover of the prenuptial agreement, a document your client signed willingly. I pushed another file across the table. This is the settlement agreement. It is not a proposal. It is a list of terms. You will find they adhere precisely to the clauses outlined in the prenup. Richard finally looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. Eleanor, you can't be serious, he pleaded, his voice cracking. This would ruin me. You ruined us, Richard, I said, my voice devoid of heat, stating it as a simple fact. This is merely the accounting of that ruin. Garrett opened the file, his eyes scanning the first page. I knew what he was seeing. Term 1, the family home, its full equity, would be transferred to my name alone. As per the prenup, the initial down payment was from my inheritance, making it a premarital asset whose appreciation was now mine. Term 2, all funds held within my personal inheritance trust, including all growth and investments made over 25 years, were designated as my sole and separate property, untouchable. Term 3, the joint investment portfolio at Sterling and Finch would be divided according to the 75-25 split stipulated in the infidelity clause. Our forensic accountant had already calculated the figures. His 25% share was significantly less than what he had siphoned into his secret account. Term 4, his business, Sterling Architecture, was his. But the capital accounts contained funds that were traceable back to my initial investment. He would be required to buy out my initial stake at its current appreciated value, a figure that would consume a significant portion of his firm's liquid assets. Term 5, he would retain his secret account, the one he had built for his new life with Isabella. That was his severance package. After taxes and legal fees, it would barely be enough to rent a decent apartment for a year. Term 6, there would be no alimony. The prenup explicitly waived it for the at-fault party in a case of infidelity. Garrett stared at the pages, his bravado completely gone, replaced by a stunned, slack-jawed silence. Richard had leaned over his shoulder. His face. The first year was a whirlwind of controlled, exhilarating chaos. The name I had chosen for my firm, Phoenix Financial, felt almost too on the nose at times, a little dramatic, but it was honest. It was the story of my own reinvention, and it became a beacon for the women who found their way to my door. My new life began not with a grand explosion, but with the quiet, satisfying click of a key turning in the lock of my new office. It was a modest space on the 7th floor of a downtown building, with a large window that looked out over the city's green, meticulously planned Central Park. The view was one of order and growth, and I took it as a good omen. In the aftermath of the settlement, I had expected to feel a profound sense of loss, a hollow space where 25 years of my life used to be. Instead, what I felt was a startling, almost dizzying lightness. The psychic weight of Richard's deceptions, of my own silent suspicions and carefully managed grief, had been lifted. I had been carrying it for so long, I hadn't realized how heavy it was until it was gone. The house, now legally and spiritually mine, felt different. I purged it of Richard's presence with a ruthless efficiency. His clothes, his golf clubs, his collection of self-important business biographies, all were packed and sent to a storage unit he had been forced to rent. I repainted the living room a warm, inviting shade of sage green. I sold the heavy, oppressive furniture he had chosen and replaced it with pieces that were lighter, more modern. I filled the space with art from local female artists and books by authors I loved. The house began to breathe again. It became my home, not just our house. Clara, my incredible daughter, delayed the start of her new job in Chicago by 3 months. She refused to leave my side. "I'm not leaving until I know you're okay, Mom," she insisted. And in her presence, I found a new kind of partnership, one built on mutual respect and a shared, unspoken understanding. We were the architects of this new reality together. She helped me choose the furniture for the office, designed a simple, elegant logo for Phoenix Financial, and built my first website. Her grief over her father's betrayal was real and profound, but she channeled it into a fierce, protective energy focused on me. Her relationship with Richard was fractured, perhaps irreparably. He had tried, in his clumsy, self-pitying way, to win her back. He sent her long, rambling emails full of justifications and blame, portraying himself as a man who had made a single, human mistake under immense pressure. He painted me as a cold, vindictive woman who had been plotting his downfall for years. Clara, with a wisdom far beyond her years, saw through it all. "He doesn't get it, Mom," she told me one evening, scrolling through a particularly pathetic message from him. "He's not sorry for what he did. He's just sorry he got caught. He's sorry it cost him." She finally wrote him a single, devastatingly simple email back. "Dad, until you can write an email that is entirely about Mom and what you did to her, with no mention of yourself, your feelings, or your finances, I don't think we have anything to talk about." He never responded to it. The silence was his answer. My first clients came through Catherine Vance, my lawyer. They were women like me, standing in the wreckage of their lives, blinking in the harsh light of a new and terrifying reality. One was a surgeon's wife of 30 years whose husband had left her for a nurse, leaving her with a mountain of shared debt she never knew existed. Another was a young widow whose husband had died suddenly, leaving behind a chaotic mess of uninsured businesses and undisclosed loans. They came to my office overwhelmed, frightened, and ashamed. I didn't just offer them financial advice. I didn't just create budgets and investment strategies. I offered them a sanctuary. I listened to their stories, not just the financial details, but the emotional ones. I recognized the language of betrayal, the shame of being deceived, the terror of an uncertain future. My own experience, which I had once viewed as a source of private pain, became my greatest professional asset. It gave me an empathy that no amount of financial certification could provide. "The first thing you need to understand," I told my first client, a woman named Sarah whose hands trembled as she clutched a folder of bewildering bank statements, "is that this is not your fault. You are not stupid. You are not naive. You trusted someone you loved. The failure is his, not yours. Our job now is not to look back at the rubble. Our job is to look at the foundations that are still standing and decide what we want to build." For the first time in years, I felt a sense of profound purpose that had nothing to do with being a wife or a mother. My corporate job before Clara was born had been about numbers and profits. This was about lives. I specialized in what I called financial forensics for the heartbroken. I taught these women how to read a bank statement, how to trace a money trail, how to understand the complex architecture of their own financial lives, which had so often been designed and controlled by their partners. I empowered them to ask the right questions, to demand transparency, and to take control. The business grew faster than I could have imagined. Word of mouth was a powerful force in the quiet, interconnected circles of women who had been wronged. My name was passed along in hushed tones at coffee shops, in lawyers' waiting rooms, and over tearful phone calls. "You need to see Eleanor Sterling," they would say. "She gets it." Within 6 months, I had to hire an assistant. A year in, I hired 2 associates, a sharp young CFP and a semi-retired forensic accountant. My little office was bustling with a quiet, focused energy. We were a team of women helping other women reclaim their power, one balance sheet at a time. I saw Richard only once during that first year. It was a chance encounter at a small downtown cafe. I was meeting a client, and he was sitting alone at a corner table, staring into a cup of coffee. I almost didn't recognize him. The bespoke suits were gone, replaced by a rumpled blazer and tired-looking khakis. The confident, expansive posture had been replaced by a weary slump. He looked ordinary, smaller. The aura of power and success he had so carefully cultivated had completely vanished. Our eyes met across the room. I saw a flicker of something in his expression, panic, shame, perhaps a ghost of the old anger. I simply gave him a small, neutral nod and turned back to my client. I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no satisfaction. He was just a man in a cafe, a stranger. The hold he had on my emotions had been broken so completely that his presence registered as nothing more than a minor, passing detail in my day. That, I realized, was the final stage of my freedom. As my business flourished, I found a new social circle. It wasn't the country club set that Richard and I had belonged to, with its brittle smiles and whispered gossip. My new friends were my clients who had become confidants, other female entrepreneurs, the artists whose work hung on my walls. Our conversations were not about stock portfolios and vacation homes, but about ideas, passions, and the messy, complicated, beautiful business of rebuilding a life. One evening, about 18 months after the settlement, Clara was visiting from Chicago. My firm had just moved into a larger suite of offices on a higher floor. We stood at the large window, looking out at the city lights twinkling below like a carpet of fallen stars. "You know what's ironic, Mom?" she said, her arm linked through mine. "I was looking at Dad's firm's financials online. They're public now that they're trying to attract new partners. Their growth has completely stalled since you left." "I'm not surprised," I said. "I was his unpaid CFO for 2 decades. I balanced the books, managed the cash flow, and planned the investments. He was the visionary, the public face. But I was the one who made sure the foundation was solid. He never saw that, did he?" Clara mused. "He thought you were just playing with household money." "Sometimes," I replied, watching the traffic flow like rivers of light along the streets below. People can only see what confirms their own narrative. In his story, he was the self-made genius, and I was the supporting character. He couldn't acknowledge my contribution without diminishing his own sense of accomplishment. Clara was silent for a moment. Then she said, "If he had just been honest from the beginning, if he had just come to you and said he was unhappy, that he'd fallen in love with someone else, what would have happened?" I considered the question, the path not taken. "He would have kept half of everything," I said simply. "We would have had an amicable, if painful, divorce. He would have had more than enough money to start his new life with Isabella. He could have had the condo, the new car, everything he wanted. His greed wasn't just for money. It was for a narrative. He needed to win. He needed me to lose. He needed to be the one who left, the one in control. The deception, the cruelty, that's what cost him everything." The woman who had stood in her living room, her world shattering around her, felt like a distant ancestor. She had been defined by her roles: Gregory's wife, Amelia's mother. Her identity was relational, dependent on others. The woman I was now, looking out over a city from an office I had built myself, was defined by her own actions, her own skills, her own resilience. I was Eleanor Sterling, founder of Phoenix Financial. mentor, advocate, survivor. On my desk, in a small, elegant silver frame, was not a photograph, but a simple, ornate silver key.